So again, my name is Kevin Hancock, Director of Solutions here at Exostar. And thanks for joining me today for our monthly webinar, or General CMMC webinar. And today's topic is tackling CMMC challenges, practical solutions and best practices. Before I get started, just a few housekeeping details. So today's webinar is scheduled to last 45 minutes to an hour. That does include Q&A. Now, you've been muted to enable me to speak without interruption today. And the questions that I'll be answering are those that were submitted prior to today's events. Now, we only got a few questions answered, but what I decided to do was elaborate on a couple of those questions that came in. So I've created, if you will, kind of a supplemental presentation at the end to address those two questions more fully. And when we get there, I'll show you what those were. If for some reason we do have an outage during today's presentation, just wait for a minute and try and refresh the page. If that doesn't work, you can go back to the email you received and use the link in that to come back into the session. Today's session is being recorded. It'll be available on demand via the Exostar resource library anytime after today's event. You can find that at www.exostar.com/resources. If at any time you'd like to speak with one of our industry experts, if you need to get a copy of this slide deck, you can reach out to us at cmmc-team@exostar.com. You can also go to our website, www.exostar.com, and reach us on the chat feature there on any page. Now, you will be receiving a follow-up to today's session with a link to the recording and the slide presentation. So no reason to ask over chat if you can get the slide presentation, because it will be sent over to you. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Here's today's agenda. We've just covered the introduction. I'm going to give you a short recap on kind of where we are in the CMMC ruling. We'll cover the CMMC scope, what assessors will expect to see when they come on site. I'll go through those question and answers, and kind of the two areas I'm going to elaborate on are how do I enter my score into the SPRS system? And then somebody asked to get an update on the Canadian CMMC program. So wanted to just kind of give everybody a quick update on on that and kind of explain what it is. So as most of you hopefully know, the proposed rule was put into the Federal Registry on December 26th of 2023. That kicked off a public comment period of 60 days. That period closed on February 26th of 2024, and the Department of Defense has been responding to those questions, inquiries, etc., as they've put together the 48 CFR, which is the Code of Federal Regulations, which really kicks off, if you will, the formal rulemaking. That was published, or that proposed rule was published on 8/15/2024. That again kicks off a 60-day public comment period. It's then responded to, and then it goes to Congress for approval. Now, some notes about CMMC. You know, the key thing here is what CMMC does, or what it changes, is that it moves away from a self-attestation model to one that requires a third-party assessment. Right? That is the whole idea behind CMMC. The DoD has required those who sign contracts with the DoD to adhere to NIST 800-171 if you receive controlled unclassified information. NIST 800-171 is how to protect information systems of non-federal organizations. And you're required to meet those 110 controls if you have controlled unclassified information. It's in your contracts. It's under the DFARS clauses. And so that's been in effect for a number of years. Now, so the major change here is that rather than everyone just saying, yep, I do these 110 controls, is you'll now have to do, say, or you'll have to do them. And once every 3 years, you'll have a third party come and assess those. And I'll cover in the next slide kind of what those different requirements are, because there are different levels of CMMC. Now, what the rule also did is it defined a couple categories that are very important to those of us who are in this industry, and because a number of us rely on third parties to help us maintain and secure this controlled unclassified information. Now, one of the things it did is it defined what was required of external service providers. These are organizations that process, store, transmit CUI or security protection data. Now, these are the folks who are typically considered MSPs. Now, you may use an MSP as part of your overall IT organization. You may engage with somebody to do a particular function for you in that IT process. Now, if those folks are doing work for you and they are involved in storage, processing, or transmission of CUI or the security protection data around your overall system, they have to be at the same CMMC level of which your organization is trying for. Oh, I got to fix that bullet. It's a little. I cut off some words when I type that. So if you work with an MSP and you are trying to achieve, say, CMMC level 2, then your MSP will also have to be, have a CMMC level 2 certification. The other, definition of a term was a cloud service provider. Now, cloud service providers are those SaaS solutions, right? Software as a service solutions that are going to store, process, or transmit controlled unclassified information. If you use a provider of a cloud service that's involved in that, they need to be a FedRAMP moderate or a FedRAMP moderate equivalent solution provider. So when you engage with a cloud service, they should be able to tell you whether or not they're FedRAMP or FedRAMP moderate equivalent. And if they're FedRAMP moderate equivalent, they'll also have what's called a body of evidence and a shared responsibility matrix, which outlines what they do, what you're required to do, and then also a body of evidence that shows you that they are FedRAMP moderate equivalent. Now, these are those different CMMC levels, right? We got 1, 2, and 3. The percentages that you see here on this slide are the number of organizations, or the percentage of organizations in the defense industrial base that's expected will require that type of level certification. So the majority of the defense industrial base is in level 1, right? That's 63%, right? That it's expected that those organizations will not receive controlled unclassified information as part of their contractual obligations or in fulfillment of a contract. So those organizations just have to meet 15 requirements. These are around what's required to do federal contract information, or FCI. This is still an annual self-assessment and an annual affirmation that you do these things. The next is level 2. Level 2, there are kind of 2 groups here. One will be allowed to do a self-assessment, but that's less than 2%. And the group or the individual that gets to decide whether or not a contract that requires level 2 can be self-assessed will be the contracting officer from the Department of Defense. They're the ones who will determine, when they let a contract, whether or not this can be a level 2 self-assessment. The majority of folks who are at this level. That's 35%, right? So 35% of the companies in the defense industrial base will require a level 2 that requires that once every 3-year certified third-party assessment. You'll engage with a C3PAO, a certified third-party assessment organization, to do an assessment of, your implementation of those NIST 800-171 controls. That third party will assess it, say whether or not you pass or fail, and then obviously issue that certificate that you hopefully pass. Level 3, right? This is a very small percentage of the DIB. These also require a third-party assessment. It's more controls, right? It's NIST 800-171 and some from 800-172. This is also a once every 3-year outside party assessment, but that outside party will be DIBCAC. That's the assessment arm of the Department of Defense. In all of these assessments, they'll still need a yearly affirmation from a senior company official. Now, as you do your self-assessment, and even when that third party comes out and does their assessment, if you haven't implemented a particular control, or if an organization determines that you haven't, or if that assessment organization determines that you haven't implemented a particular control, you can open what's called a POAM, a Plan of Action and Milestones. That's this is a recognition that, look, we still need to implement this, or we haven't implemented this in the correct manner. We need to fix that. This is how we're going to fix that, and this is the date in which we're going to fix it. You can have a POAM, and they can be open for 180 days. Now, only certain of those controls, if it's the assessment organization doing the assessment at that time, are actually able to have POAMs against them. They can only be those controls that are worth 1 point. All controls are worth somewhere between 1, 3, or 5 points. If you have all 110 implemented, your score is 110. If you don't, your score is going to range somewhere between a -203 and 110. But so if you have a POAM, it can only be opened against level 1 controls, or not level 1, but those controls that are worth 1 point. And there are a few that can't be in those 1-pointers, and those are outlined in the NIST 800-171 assessment guide, NIST 800-171A. Now, when CMMC comes into effect, and it will come into effect, it's expected to actually come into effect sometime in early 2025, right? All the indicators are, right? All the kind of different steps have been taking place throughout 2024, all, kind of building to it actually taking an effect. It looks like it'll take effect in that first quarter of 2025, but there is a 30-month phase-in period. And in that period, right, that first 6 months, it's still going to be in a self-assessment. In that next 6 months, you'll start to see the introduction of the requirement of that level 2 certification on new contracts. After that, you'll start to see level 2 being written in to ongoing contracts, or the continuing of existing contracts. And you'll also start to see the level 3 self-assessment. It's option periods of contracts. That's what that was the word I was struggling for in that first part. And then in phase 4 will be full implementation. So that's kind of where we are, right? So expect to see CMMC appear in government contracts. It'll fall under DFARS clause 7021. And that's when, it'll start to tell you which levels, and if you receive CUI, you'll be required that once every 3-year certified third-party assessment. Now, there are requirements that you have today, right? As I mentioned before, CMMC is really just a refinement of existing contractual clauses. It's that refinement which is going to require this third-party assessment. So if you've got current contracts with the Department of Defense, you should look at those. If you've agreed to, 70, those clauses, and you've got a contract that has clause 7012 or 7019, right? You've already signed up to be implementing those NIST 800-171 if you receive controlled unclassified information as part of that contract. If you've got that 7019 clause, what that requires is for you to go into the Department of Defense's SPRS system. That's the Supplier Performance Risk System, and enter your self-assessment score. Remember just a little bit ago, I talked about the scoring of each of the different controls? Well, that's where this comes into play, right? You do a self-assessment of your organization against those 110 controls. Those that you've implemented, you get a score, 1, 3, or 5. Those you haven't implemented, you take off 1, 3, or 5, and you get a score somewhere between the -203 and 110. Those controls you haven't implemented, you should have a POEM against them and a plan to address those. You take that score and you go into the SPRS system and you enter it. And the Department of Defense uses that as one of their performance metrics in the overall supplier performance risk system when they're awarding contracts. And as I mentioned, somebody asked, how do we do this? So I've got some slides at the end that kind of walk you through the different steps that go ahead and enter that score. And I've also got links to guides and the actual websites and things like that. So that will be shared out as well. Now, the Department of Defense is very confident that CMMC 2.0 will go into effect, right? The Deputy DoD CIO came out about 45 days ago and said, we are moving forward with CMMC 2. This is a program that has been ongoing for a number of years. It's continuing to march against the timeline that it was originally done, and regardless of, this was started under a Republican administration, it continued to move forward under Democratic administration. So, it's fully expected that it will continue along that march and will be put into place. So let's go ahead and start with today's webinar topic, actually tackling that CMMC challenge. So how do I go about getting ready for this third-party assessment? Now, the first thing you're going to want to do is determine whether or not you are a level 2, a level 1, or a level 3 organization. And the best way to do that is ask your contracting officer, right? They're the ones who will be letting contracts to you. They're the ones who should be able to tell you whether or not in the contracts you currently have, whether or not you'll be receiving controlled unclassified information. They're the ones who'll most likely be able to tell you what to expect, in the next round of contracts. When you decide, kind of what level, if you're going to be a level 2 or a level 3, you've kind of got two different choices within your organization. And all of these are around the scope of the system that processes, stores, or transmits that controlled unclassified information. And really the two things are, look, am I going to set up my entire organization to meet these 110 controls, or can I separate it out into what's typically called an enclave and only allow access to those individuals and those tools that are store, process, or transmit that CUI into the enclave? And can I limit the scope of the overall system? Or because maybe my entire business is, as is part of my contractual fulfillment of the DoD, maybe it makes more sense for me to go all in and kind of put in place these controls across my entire business. Each of these are going to have a user impact, right? When you're talking about an enclave, you're typically talking about two distinct systems, two distinct things. One is where we're going to store, process, and transmit CUI, and one is where we're going to do, kind of the day-to-day, parts of the business. So you may do email, you may do calendaring, scheduling, you may put your non-government drawings, etc., store them in different places, servers, etc. But when you do get CUI, you're going to put it into the enclave. If you're, if the controlled unclassified information is physical documents, you're going to put them in secured file cabinets. You're going to think about physical security of that particular room. It's very similar with your IT systems. If you receive controlled unclassified information, when you receive it, what do I do with it? And in order to figure that out, the way to think about this is really to follow the data. And you'll want to create a data flow diagram that shows, kind of how do we receive controlled unclassified information? When it comes into our organization, where do we store it? And when you ask where do you store it, you've got to think not only about where the primary storage is, but if this is an IT system, right, and these are electronic files, it's also about where or how do I back it up? What's my disaster recovery plans, etc. You then also want to think about the individuals that interact with that data and how do they interact with it. So if salespeople in my organization receive RFPs, and as part of those RFPs, they receive drawings that are CUI, then those sales individuals may be people that store or process controlled unclassified information. They may just store it, but so how do they work with that information? Where do they put it? When they hand it over to the folks that are actually going to build this thing, do those people just need to look at the drawing, the file, etc., or do they actually need to manipulate information from there? And then will what they create also be controlled unclassified information? We're going to store that out. And when you think of these different flows, you also need to consider the people who also support that system. And this is oftentimes where those MSPs come into play, right? Those managed service providers may be a part of your outsourced IT organization. So they may have administrative accounts to some of these places where you're storing the information. They may have administrative rights to different CAD systems and things like that. So those folks, that's why those folks may also have to, or you may require, or they are required, sorry, that's not might, they are required to also be CMMC level 2 certified if they're part of that controlled unclassified information store, process, transmit capabilities. And then there is also a physical side to this, right? If you have to extract that data, if you've got to, move it somewhere or display it somewhere, etc., there are also physical controls and physical security controls to also consider. Maybe you're not just a virtual office. Maybe you are a factory and you have a shop floor and things like that. So in those cases, the physical security of the location, building, etc., they're also in scope for this overall system. And the reason I keep harping back to the system is because at the end of the day, what you're going to create is what's called a system security plan. And you get to define the system that is part of that overall system security plan. You tell the assessors, hey, for my organization, this is the boundary of my overall system. Some other things to consider, right? This is a simple turtle diagram that might help you, right? If you're not comfortable with this kind of diagram, you might want to try something like this, which just shows the different inputs and things that play across that controlled unclassified information. This is a sample company that I use in my demonstrations called Glory Minerals. Exostar has the gloryminerals.com domain, so we can have a sample company. And this is where, kind of we spec'd out, okay, so Glory Minerals is a contractor for specialty metals. It's only a portion of their business, and in this business, they receive CUI. The different employees that may interact with that CUI they receive are the ones you see up there in the kind of upper left quadrant. We store that information in an Exostar solution called Exostar Managed Microsoft 365. That gives us a secure enclave up in GCC High. We have processes to add users, give them particular roles. We conduct training across our organization. We only access this information via our web browser, right? We enforce Edge or Chrome on the desktops of our particular users. We don't have to manipulate the data or anything like that. So we, if you will, our processing of data is really just reading documents, reading PDFs, things like that. And sooner or later, the contract will end, and we'll maintain it in accordance with our data retention policies, and then we'll delete that information. Now, that overall system is going to be defined, right? So we're gonna give it a name. We're gonna decide whether or not it's across the whole organization or just an enclave. We're going to define the responsible individuals, right? Because there are checks and balances across the organization for our system when we need to change things, right? This isn't just kind of a one-time fill out a spreadsheet and submit, right? You really should consider CMMC and NIST 800-171 as a program. It's something that's going to need to be continually monitored, updated. Go with, if you change technologies, if you change your organization a little bit, things like that, you need to update your policies, procedures, tools, etc., to meet those. Within your system security plan, you should have those data flow diagrams that define the system. You should have an inventory of your software, your hardware, and you need to start gathering really any cybersecurity policies you currently have written, and also any other policies, because even though, right, we typically focus around cybersecurity when we think about CMMC and NIST 800-171, it's really about your overall organization security. So if you've got policies on how you onboard people, how you do background checks, whether or not you have physical, whether or not you have a building and how you control access into your building. Do your badge employees, do you have them, scan a card to get into the building? Do you have a visitor log when people check in, give them credentials? Those are all policies, procedures that are around the physical security that also become part of your overall system security plan. So once you've defined that system and the data flows and the different pieces of it, you should diagram that system. Because again, when those assessors come on site, it's much easier if you have a well-defined system to limit what they're going to assess to only those areas that store, process, or transmit CUI. You want to think about if you're utilizing any third-party services, those cloud service providers, whether or not you've got those external service providers. You need to include your security protection assets. So what makes up that boundary? Do you have a firewall at the edge of your corporate network? If so, you've got to identify that. You should know what policies you have in place for that firewall to make sure that people can't get into your boundary. And traffic only goes outbound and only certain kinds of traffic, etc. If you've got other things in that boundary, if you've got CNC machines, printers, etc., those are typically considered specialized assets. They need to be identified. You need to know how you interact with them. You need to ensure that that if they do have things that you can do to encrypt things and wall them off on your local network, etc., you do those kinds of things. And then you may have assets within your building that are totally out of scope, right? You may have those folks and those systems that aren't part of CUI. You may have a logical separation of your corporate network, and you should be able to kind of segment that off, wall it off, let people know that. So all of these things go into your system diagram. So when you do create that system security plan, you can present that to the assessors. And the assessors are going to look for those things that provide them that boundary, so they know what's in scope. They know that it's this hardware, this network. You're going to have to create policies and procedures for each of the 14 control families in NIST 800-171, and you'll want written procedures for each of the 110 controls. This is how we do this. And then you've got to provide the artifacts that prove that you do that. So when the assessors come on site, they're going to evaluate your overall system security plan. They're going to look for, those things up top, right? Those network and hardware inventories, those network diagrams, the data flow diagram, etc. They're going to look for those policies and plans for those 14 security domains, any supporting documents, your processes and procedures for each of those domains, and each of the individual controls within those. If you've implemented a particular control and you've done that in a technical manner, so for example, we limit access to only these approved users. We have user accounts defined in, say, Azure Entra. And this are the security groups we utilize and how we assign those. You should have the artifacts, screenshots, and configurations. Those screenshots and configurations are the artifacts that prove you've implemented that policy, kind of in the way you have it outlined in your policies and procedures. Now, for some of these controls, and it's going to vary depending on the assessor, they're also going to ask the person responsible for that control to actually demonstrate how they do that. And then, as I mentioned before, if you do have controlled unclassified information on site, like physically on site, they're also going to do a physical inspection of your facility and look at and verify that you have those controls in place that you've mentioned in your overall system security plan. So as I mentioned before, we only got about 5 questions in. So I'm going to answer those questions. And for the last 2, I've kind of built out a little more addendum, if you will, to this presentation. So before I start with that, I do want to go ahead and start a poll. I'd love it for everyone to, if you could fill this out and give us the feedback. This lets us know how we did today, as well as provides us feedback on what we're going to do, and we'll request topics and things like that. So appreciate that. So let me go ahead and answer the questions. So what's the difference between NIST 800-171 and CMMC 2.0? So as you probably heard as I talked about this throughout today's conversation, and if you've attended others of other webinars that I do, they're very intertwined. The way I think about this is that CMMC is the overall program, right? Cybersecurity maturity model certification. That's the overall program. As part of that program, for level 2, you have to satisfy NIST 800-171. So that's the standard for level 2 of CMMC. And don't confuse CMMC 2.0 with level 2. CMMC 2.0 refers to the revision number of the CMMC program. So CMMC is the overall program. NIST 800-171 is the standard you have to meet if you want to achieve level 2 certification underneath that program. Right? NIST 800-171 is from the National Institute of Standards. They're the ones who came up with the requirements for what you need to do if you receive controlled unclassified information and how you protect that. Hopefully that answered everybody's questions about that. So question number 2, is it easier at this point to get with a third party? You know, this one, the only answer I can really, I can only suggest is it depends. It depends how much expertise you have and how much your organization has in order to you to manage a CMMC 2.0 program for your organization. It might be that you just, you're a small organization that just does level 1. And, it's pretty easy to satisfy those 15 requirements for level 1. And so you may not need a third party. However, if you're a small organization that is also that receives controlled unclassified information and you don't have the expertise nor the time to, satisfy or to make sure you satisfy all 110 controls, you may need the assistance of an MSP, what's called in the CMMC community a registered practitioner organization, an RPO, to help you, kind of get ready, help you with your policies, your procedures, make sure you have the right technology in place for that, etc. So it really is going to depend. So we often get this other question, the question number 3. Please address the situation of a COTS reseller avoiding the need for CMMC. So I was smiling when I read this question because I really can't address the situation of anyone avoiding CMMC, right? If you sign a contract with the Department of Defense or a subcontract to somebody that has that contract, you most likely will follow under the CMMC program. Now, if you are a COTS reseller, right, and COTS means commercial off the shelf. If you don't build specialty products, if you just resell or sell commercial off the shelf software, widgets, screws, bolts, etc., you may only require or receive FCI, federal contract information. You'll still be required to satisfy CMMC, but it'll only be level 1, right? And the reason for that is you most likely will not receive controlled unclassified information because your information is already public. It's commercial off the shelf. It means all the specs, all the information about your product solutions, etc., are already publicly available, right? Somebody can browse your website and find this information. So that is why you should be able to, you can be just level 1 rather than level 2. So you won't avoid it, but you won't have to implement all 110 controls of an organization that is receiving controlled unclassified information. So the fourth question, was what are ways to submit the SSP to the SPRS system? And there's really only one way that I know of to do this, and it's through the SPRS website. And so, I went out and I gathered the information. But before I jump into that, just let me give you a plug for Exostars and our CMMC Ready suite. This includes really 3 SaaS applications that help you in this overall CMMC journey. If you're struggling to write those policies and procedures for those 14 control families or domains, Exostar has an application called Policy Pro. Policy Pro has templates for those different 14 control families. You can then customize those templates to fit your organization. It then has an AI engine that will score those policies, give you indications of what you may need to fix, add, delete, etc. If you've got existing policies, you can utilize that same AI engine to run them through it and again, get that score out to see how you're doing. If you're ready to do a self-assessment, right, you've kind of gone through and you want to determine how you're doing, or if you want a place to manage that overall CMMC program, Exostar has, once again, a SaaS application called Certification Assistant. Certification Assistant, it allows you to go through and determine whether or not you've implemented or not implemented a particular control, provide you a place to upload that policy library or link to, because I'd always suggest you link to these policy libraries rather than actually upload each individual policy. So link to those, make sure that you have those policies and procedures defined under each control. Go ahead and put that body of evidence against each control of how you do that and links to those different artifacts that prove that you do. Allows you to create a task if there's a recurring step in that overall policy. So for example, some of these policies are around training and other things that you need to review on a periodic basis. So you may want to create a recurring task to remind yourself to do that, have evidence that you actually perform that task and things like that. So Certification Assistant allows you to create those recurring tasks right there. If you haven't implemented a control, it allows you to create a POAM against that particular control and then manage that POAM to closure. If you're looking for a secure enclave to store, process, or transmit that controlled unclassified information, Exostar has our managed Microsoft 365. This is an enclave up in GCC High, managed and supported by Exostar's tech ops team, with an Exostar app embedded within it, which maintains those controls. It satisfies 85 of those 110 controls while you're there in the enclave. This is a FedRAMP moderate equivalent cloud service, and Exostar will provide that body of evidence once CMMC is in effect. And then if you are looking for that third-party organization to help you, that RPO or MSP, Exostar has a number of partners available from our website. You can actually work with them directly there within Certification Assistant to manage that overall CMMC program with you. So let me go ahead and outline basically how you submit that SPRS or that score into the SPRS system, I should say. Now, I do want to be clear that I'm just going to rehash here what's already in a guide, right? So if you look at this, right, I've got the website here. This is the SPRS website. It's got some great help on here, right? There are tutorials. These are videos that you can watch on how to do this, and this is a guide itself. So I just went through this guide and I grabbed screenshots and I put them here for you. And I've also linked these in here so when you get the slide deck, you can also see them. So you basically go to the SPRS website, you click on log in to PIEE. This will bring you to this page. You click log in. Once you're logged in, if you don't already have a login, right, the other choice there was new user. You can create the login for you. Once you go in, you click on the SPRS icon. You select the NIST 800-171 assessment. You'll be taken to a page that says, NIST SP 800-171 DoD assessment, and you'll create a header for that. When you created your account, you were provided a cage code. You put that cage code in. Now, when you see these different assessment standards and the confidence level will be basic for self-assessments. And that's typically what you'll be entering at this time. This is your score based on your self-assessment. Once you've completed that header, you'll see different choices in this kind of spreadsheet. You click View Details, and if you haven't done this yet, right, you click Add New Assessment. When you click that Add New Assessment, you'll be brought to a form. You fill out the form, including that SPRS score as you've determined it, either using Exostar's certification assistant, because that'll keep your score as you fill out the assessment, or you can use the 800-171 assessment guide, score yourself, put that score in, what date you completed it, etc. And then you click Save. You can then go back at any time and edit that assessment. So if you change something, if you close a POAM, etc., you go back into the SPRS system, you edit that SSP, and you improve your score because you've closed POAMs and you've improved your overall score. So as I mentioned, you will get this deck. It has these links embedded within it. We've also provided some additional information as well. Now, the last question before I leave you today was about the Canadian CMMC program. Whoops, sorry, went the wrong way. So in 2023, Canada announced that they were going to start the Canadian program for cybersecurity certification. Their goal with this program is to very much mirror the US's CMMC rules, but obviously this is Canada. They may have some additional requirements, but they are also going to seek reciprocity with the US Department of Defense. Now, the reciprocity isn't there yet, but the overall program is currently being initiated within Canada. There's a pilot period in 2024. Then once we move into 2025, there should be notifications about it being in effect, and that they'll be seeking that reciprocity with the US DoD. As you'll see, right, in the different levels, this very much like CMMC, Canada has level 1, level 2, and level 3. Level 2, much like CMMC level 2, requires that external assessment. Level 3 requires the Canadian Defense Ministry to do that external assessment once every 3 years. So the requirements are very much similar. There are just as NIST, National Institute of Standards, has 800, 171, and 172 as kind of the ruling standards for level 2 and level 3. Canada's Community Security Establishment, their standards body, will be creating the standard for their needs, but they have said that they'll adopt closely to what NIST 800, 171, and 172 have within it. So just another indication that this is a growing concern across Western countries. It's not going away. Even if you look at other government agencies, U.S. government agencies outside the DoD, they're also adopting the NIST 800-171 standard. They're adopting controlled unclassified information as a category, as a contractual category, and things like that. So, this is going to be more ever present in any government contracting area as we move forward. So just want to thank everybody for joining me today. Hopefully this gave you some valuable information moving forward. As you know, we host a number of webinars every month. We host 3 product webinars, one every Thursday at 2 o'clock. That's on our Managed Microsoft 365. We do a monthly Policy Pro and Certification Assistant webinar, and then we also do a monthly general CMMC webinar. If at any time you'd like to reach out to us, feel free. You can reach us at cmmc-team@exostar.com. So again, everybody, thanks for joining me today and hope you have a great day.